Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars Top 5, the series where we count down something within the Star Wars universe. We've got what I consider to be a very fun list today because we're looking at one of the most under-examined areas of Star Wars warfare, speeders. Now, even if you're a hardcore Star Wars fan, you might not know exactly what I mean when I say the word speeder. Usually when you talk about flying things in the Star Wars universe, you talk about starfighters or capital ships or somewhere in between those. The speeder, however, is completely different. Whereas starfighters are meant to operate in space, speeders operate within the atmosphere of a planet. In other words, think of starfighters like spaceships, while speeders are airplanes. Speeders are really underutilized in Star Wars canon, and a lot of this comes from the fact that if you're going to use something to fly through the atmosphere, it might as well also work as a starfighter. The Empire, for example, will typically use some sort of TIE fighter when fighting in atmosphere. Those ships obviously can also fight in space. With that being said, one of the most famous Rebel ships is actually a speeder. That, of course, is the Snowspeeder, as featured in the Battle of Hoth. You wouldn't be able to take a Snowspeeder in space, it would have a maximum ceiling, it would only work in atmosphere. Of course, when you think about it, that does make sense, but the fact isn't immediately obvious. So today we're counting on the top 5 speeders with the rules that I've included. In other words, it operates only in atmosphere, not in space. Also, we're going to include all variants of one speeder type as the same, because I don't want ships like the T-47 to absolutely dominate the list. With the rules out of the way, we'll get to the list now in just a second. I do want to say that if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and also giving me a thumbs up. Anyway, let's start with number 5. Number 5 is the Skyhopper brand of speeders, and the fact that Skyhoppers even make this list kind of tells you that speeders and in-atmosphere combat is something that hasn't really been explored in the Star Wars universe, at least not to the degree that space warfare has. The Skyhoppers came in various models. On one side, you have the T-16 like Luke Skywalker had, and then you have more militarized versions, but they all had one thing in common: extreme speed and extreme maneuverability. Although technically Skyhopper is a generic term for certain types of speeders, realistically it means a certain line of craft created by the Incom Corporation, the guys who also made the X-Wings for the Rebel Alliance. As I said, there are various models of Skyhoppers. I also mentioned that they all had one key feature and that they're very fast, but they would also typically only have one weapon, with most models having a cannon mounted to the bottom of their cockpit. Still, even with this rather unimpressive firepower and similarly likely unimpressive durability, the Skyhopper's sheer speed and maneuverability make it quite a dangerous craft. On a completely unrelated note, I find it interesting how Krennic's shuttle from Rogue One looks almost exactly like a Skyhopper, with its sharp, triangular, geometric edges. Number 5 is the PTB-625 Planetary Bomber, another Incom Corporation vehicle. Unfortunately, we don't really know very much about the PTB-625, other than that it was very closely related to the ARC-170. It was used primarily by the Republic as a bomber during the Clone Wars, but as is the case with much technology of that era, it did eventually make its way into the hands of the Rebellion. Like the ARC-170, this vehicle was extremely well armed, especially for its role. It had twin laser cannons, auto lasers, and then a proton bombing bay to deliver high payloads to ground-based targets. Think of it as a most likely even faster, probably better armed Y-Wing. However, it can't operate in space, only in atmosphere. In all honesty though, you would think that in most cases it would be preferable to just use an ARC-170 or a Y-Wing or some other ship in a bombing configuration. However, it's possible that ships like these, airspeeders generally, were cheaper to produce. Really the question of why and where does this fit in is one we see a lot when we look at airspeeders. At number 3 we have the T-47 line, which is by far the most famous line of airspeeders in Star Wars. Also designed by Incom Systems, the Snowspeeder used at the Battle of Hoth was simply one variant of the T-47 line. The ship in its basic form would be used for reconnaissance or perhaps even civilian purposes. However, there were many upgraded versions of the T-47 available either on the market or to those with spare parts. The Snowspeeders at Hoth, for example, had extra armor when compared to a stock T-47. We also see the Tachyon Fast Attack Airspeeder. That's kind of the opposite of the Snowspeeder. Airspeeder. Instead of adding on armor, they remove every piece of redundant or unnecessary material from the craft, making it as fast as possible. Ships like the Tachyon and even the T-47s generally were very maneuverable, which is where most of their benefit comes from. Before we continue with the rest of the list, I would just like to take a second to mention some of the vehicles that didn't quite make it for whatever reason. First, we have the Talon Combat Cloud Car, and this appears in The Last Command, and you guys know that the Thrawn trilogy is some of my favorite stuff from the Star Wars Legends Expanded Universe. These things are basically upgraded cloud cars like the kind we see on Cloud City. I was close to adding them on the list, but I feel like they got beat out even by the Skyhopper. Similarly, we have the Wookiee ships, the Fluttercraft, and they seem quite cool, and everything the Wookiees make seems to be very impressive and very powerful, but we haven't really seen them in action enough for me to make a fair determination, and I do have some very real questions about their maneuverability, although they do seem to be very well armed. There are also several ships which I wasn't sure if I could honestly classify as speeders. For example, the Yuuzhan Vong have several ships, including the Sick Vi, that we only really see operate in atmosphere, but I'm not convinced that they can't operate in space. If they could only operate in atmosphere, they would have made it on this list, because Yuuzhan Vong technology is incredibly impressive, and typically speeders are unshielded, so the Dovin basils used by the Sick Vi, for example, would give it a huge advantage. The Separatists also use what's called a Conqueror Dreadnought, which we see in one of the Clone Wars comics. It's basically a very large flying base. Again, I'm not sure if this really fits the spirit of the video, so I didn't include it on this list. Anyway, back on topic. Number 2 is the AHS Heavy Assault Airspeeder, and I did a really in-depth video on this vehicle the other day because I think that it may have at least partially inspired the future resistant speeder that we've seen images of for The Last Jedi. The Heavy Assault Airspeeder was essentially a reconfigured V-Wing made to fly only in atmosphere and made specifically in response to the Rebel Alliance's failings at the Battle of Hoth. The Alliance realized that they needed something to take out large ground vehicles like, for example, AT-ATs, and they also needed something that was cheap, so they reconfigured V-Wings to be used only in atmosphere. Due to their nature and intended purposes, these ships are extremely well armed. They're also very, very fast and have quite a decent top speed. They aren't, however, maneuverable. Much of this is due to the sheer amount of weight on the craft and the fact that repulsorless alone can only do so much. For more on the AHS Walker Buster, I'm going to link a video where I talked about how it relates to the Resistance's new speeder in The Last Jedi. Number 1 is the V-Wing, and people always ask me, how come the V-Wing hasn't appeared on any of my starfighter videos? Well, that's because the V-Wing isn't in fact a starfighter, it's an airspeeder. As with every single ship on this list except for the last one, the main features that make the V-Wing accessible are its immense speed and impressive maneuverability. Adding to this impressive speed is the scramjet system, which basically allows the V-Wing to boost through the air at incredible speeds. On a starfighter level, the V-Wing really isn't well armed, but on a speeder level, it does quite well for itself with a dedicated blaster cannon under each wing. These cannons could be fired in a special rapid mode, but would burn out quickly, as anyone who's played the Rogue Squadron video game would know. Anyone who's played Rogue Squadron would also know that in the game at least, these ships have homing missiles. Apparently that's not something that's been carried over through the rest of canon, but I still count it anyway. Regardless, even without these missiles, the sheer maneuverability and really impressive speed of this ship, along with its advanced systems, make it highly dangerous and, in my opinion, the most dangerous aircraft in Star Wars Legends. I'm absolutely sure that I missed some entries on this list. Speeders aren't really heavily discussed in the Star Wars universe, they don't get very much attention, and in most cases, they're less effective than just a regular starfighter would. It's also at times unclear whether a ship operating in atmosphere is actually an airspeeder or if it's just a starfighter flying close to the planet. So if I missed something, please let me know, and if you liked this video, also let me know that so I know to make more top 5 lists in the future. Although, to be honest, I don't think they'll be going away anytime soon, regardless of how this video does. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, guys. As always, this has been your host, EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.